Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project with me, Chris Akers. And on this podcast, we talk about arts, culture, politics, sport, and anything else worth talking about. Now, today's guest is Denise Fahmy, who's going to talk to me about particularly the arts and particularly her story. It's a fascinating story. I've just reread it. And I suggest you stay behind and have a listen to what she has to say. Hello, Denise.
Hi, Chris. Nice to meet you.
Likewise, and likewise. Now, in regards to your story, before we get to the main crux of your story, can you just explain who you are? And because well, I asked you to be interviewed with regards to the arts, but who you are, and what your journey has been to get to this point.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm a northerner and I have worked in the arts for many years. And I used to work at Arts Council England for 15 years. And I left in May last year, May 23. And along with a woman called Rosie Kay, who's a choreographer, we set up an organisation called Freedom in the Arts, in which we are expressing concerns about censorship and self-censorship in the arts. And we're trying to kind of campaign really to enable people to speak out about their own personal concerns of politicisation in the arts, and to look at ways that government or stakeholders can protect artistic freedom.
So we've had Rosie on the podcast before, last year. It was a very insightful interview. But in regards to that she spoke about her story in regards to the artistic side. But as you say, you used to work for Arts Council England. So it's more, it's arts, but it's more, imagine the more administrative side as well. So can you just explain your story in regards to what happened with Arts Council England and what the conclusion of that story was?
Yeah, well, if I just describe sort of the arts funding structure, I suppose, in this country, there's 4 arts councils in the 4 different nations, Arts Council England being the biggest, and it receives, well, all of them receive funding from government, either national or Scottish Government, Northern Irish, all of their devolved administrations. And they also receive funding from the National Lottery. So when you buy a lottery ticket, there's a percentage of every lottery ticket that goes to good causes. And the arts is one of those good causes. So they distribute funding through regular grants or through project grants to thousands of organisations and individuals every year. So my job was in visual arts, and that meant that I supported organisations that received regular funding from the Arts Council. And I also helped to get funding to individual artists or to organisations that were making projects or holding exhibitions. So it was a really interesting job, and I'm sure that people know that people working in the arts are quite an interesting bunch. So, I got to see lots of exciting exhibitions, work with great people, and really, it's a progressive organisation. It's a good employer, and I enjoyed my time there. But as time went on, you sort of feel organisations change. I guess culture changes. And I don't mean necessarily artistic culture, but the political space around you changes. And the arts funding system kind of got more and more politicised. And I think artists became more politicised as well. And that crept into the funding system as well. So I was always a little bit concerned about trying to stay impartial. As a funder, as an administrator, you've got a legal responsibility to be impartial, by which I mean that whether you like a project or not, that's not the issue. The issue is how it meets a funding criteria. And you've got to put away any of your personal views, which I think is right. So that was a very strong guiding principle of how to work as a public servant. But I do think that understanding of that amongst the staff cohort kind of fell away a little bit as time progressed. But perhaps that's a perception. But what it led to in the end was that one particular applicant made an application for a very small grant. And the grant was for £10,000. I think it was £9,500. And it was made by an organisation called the LGB Alliance. Now, I don't know if people have heard about LGB Alliance. They set up in 2019. They have been a little bit bedeviled by constant accusations and court cases, but essentially they're just about supporting same-sex attracted individuals, which has set them outside some of the sort of mainstream LGBT organisations, which include people that have got gender reassignment and other lifestyles. So they just see it as same-sex attracted. Anyway, they are a legal charity and they're perfectly entitled to apply for a grant, and the grant was awarded to them. But because they've had this sort of struggle online to be seen as sort of an acceptable charity, a legal charity, it led to a lot of denunciation online of the Arts Council giving this grant out. And it also led to a lot of disquiet, or it led to some disquiet internally among staff at the Arts Council. Perhaps I'll talk about that a little bit later, but the repercussion of that was that a senior member of staff decided to have an all-staff meeting, you know, sort of like a struggle session about what to do with this one grant. Now, this is really unusual because I'd been working there for 15 years and I'd never, ever been to an all-staff meeting. So that is potentially up to 700 members of staff talking about one grant. And in that year, the Arts Council gave out nearly £1 billion of funding. So to suggest that 700 people come to a meeting and talk about a grant of £10,000 is a ludicrous waste of public money. You know, I mean, a full meeting would cost more than the actual grant so, in staff time. Anyway, so the meeting went ahead. 400 members of staff joined the meeting online. So you can imagine how much that cost. It was a half-hour meeting. And I'd assumed that the Arts Council was under a lot of media pressure for having made this award. So I had assumed that the meeting would go along the lines of kind of sitting on the fence, really, and just taking questions from members of staff. But it didn't go along those lines. It went along the lines of the senior manager saying that he didn't agree with this organisation and didn't think the grant should have been made, and also believed the organisation had a history of transphobia. And I was really shocked by this because, again, as I've said, the organisation, the Arts Council, has to be an impartial organisation because it's giving out public funds. That is a legal premise. That's the way it has to operate. And as far as I was concerned, it always had been pretty much an impartial organisation to the best of its ability. So I was really shocked to see that, and I objected to that statement, said I thought that this manager was mistaken. Now, obviously, this was all an online meeting, so it's quite we've all been to online meetings now, but it can, even in online meetings, it can feel quite high pressure. When you know that the majority of people are watching this meeting, and my heart was pounding, and I felt other members of staff starting to talk slightly more hostilely towards me in the meeting. Anyway, we got the meeting over and done with, and after that, I put a complaint in about the statements that the manager had made, because I thought it was completely inappropriate that we should take a view on an applicant's beliefs. That's no way to give up public funding. And what also happened was that the grant to the applicant, the LGB Alliance, was actually withdrawn. So it seemed to me that there may have been pressure exerted on the other organisation to withdraw the funding to LGB Alliance. So I made a formal complaint as a whistleblower under the what's called the Protected Information Disclosure Act, which meant that complaint went to the very top of the organisation, which is the chair, which is Sir Nicholas Sirota. Whilst that complaint was in motion, a couple of weeks later, some of my colleagues then launched a petition, an online petition that was put up on our intranet. And this petition was calling for signatures to support a collective grievance. It didn't say really why, but against gender critical people in the organisation and HR. So to put in a grievance against people that are perceived to be gender critical in some way. And this petition was held online for a day and a half, even though I did write to say get it taken down. I asked other members of staff actually requested for the petition to be taken down. But 140 people signed this petition in my organisation, and some of them wrote really offensive things, and it was quite a grueling kind of 36 hours of watching this happening, and I was very distressed by it. And I was very shocked that the organisation didn't just take it down to begin with, and eventually they took it down as a breach of the IT policy. So following that, I then put in another complaint saying that I felt I'd been harassed. And I felt that it had come from the original meeting, in which I'd spoken out on behalf, I suppose, or in support of the LGB Alliance. And the person that had been most critical at that meeting had also gone on to write this petition. Anyway, I went through the whole system with both of those complaints, and my complaint was brought together in one complaint. So one of it was a whistleblowing on the grounds of a lack of impartiality towards an applicant, and the second one was a grievance about harassment. And they were overseen by an Arts Council trustee, and both of them were effectively dismissed with the view that there was some truth in the complaints that I'd made, but there was no real actions to be taken further. And I was absolutely gobsmacked. I couldn't believe that something as blatant as both of those complaints would be dismissed by a public body that both myself and indeed the current government, or the government of 2017, believed was a very strong and a good public body. You know, I mean, I was really shocked by it, and I thought it was, I guess, you know, sort of a bad day for the public sector, really, that we've got to that point. So I did two things. I wrote to the Secretary of State for Culture and made a complaint about the lack of impartiality of the grant. And I put in a claim to the Employment Tribunal in Leeds in September of 2022. Yeah. My complaint to the Secretary of State saw some discussion at, not directly, but was the essence of it was raised by the Department for Culture, Media and Sports Parliamentary Committee, and the chief executive was questioned, but ultimately, again, it was dismissed. There was no investigation into whether there'd been pressure applied to have the LGB Alliance grant withdrawn. And my case trundled its way through the Employment Tribunal. So before I get to that, do you want to ask me anything? Because I feel like I've been talking for ages.
No, it's perfectly fine. I mean, see, things like this shouldn't shock me anymore, because we've had stories like this from all different sectors for the last decade or so. And yet your story, even though I've read it, does still shock me, unfortunately. Um, just rewind a bit. You said about there should be impartiality when it comes to rewarding grants, and I agree with that. But were there any instances before this where you thought, I'm not sure about this? Like, say, for example, if it was, and these are obvious tropes, but say if it was genuinely racist or genuinely sexist, and you're showing that, would there be a situation where you would not award that grant and you would have to explain why that was the case because of, I don't know, discriminatory, or would you just say, no, we just see this as art and then therefore we'll just go ahead and let you have the grant?
Oh God, that's a really complicated question. First of all, there's massive competition for grants.
Hmm.
So, you're talking about half the grants won't get through, so you're already able to kind of cut out quite a lot of grants. Secondly, there's quite a strict criteria for what gets funded. So that helps to be selective. Thirdly, in terms of racism, not so much racism, that in terms of how the government operates, is there is a prescribed list of organisations that we can't fund. And some of those, and quite in fact, quite a few of those are openly racist organisations.
Hmm.
So it's really important, and it's not just the arts, it's the whole public sector, and that list is called prescribed organisations. It's online. It's relevant to the whole public sector. So anything that's related to that, we can't fund those anyway by law. Now, if something comes in and it's openly racist, um, would it get through? For a range of reasons, it probably wouldn't get through. But then you look at something like the kind of blackout performances that are happening in London theatres,
Yeah, yeah.
and which white people can't come into that space, and that's funded. Some of that is funded through public funding. Now, that's a race policy, whether you support it or not, that is a race policy. So there are some really difficult questions in there that will get discussed, but there isn't actually criteria in the funding which says no, you can't fund it. However, there is the law and the sorry, I'm being a real terrible
No, no, I
bureaucrat,
understand. I
but
understand.
every
Yeah,
funding agreement fits within the law, and if something breaches the law, then it can't be funded.
yeah, because I think it's interesting. You mentioned there about the blackout performances.
Yeah,
I mean, personally, I'm not a fan of those, and I think it's a race policy. I'd
yeah.
be curious. Maybe it's not something I made public as to why they allowed that to be publicly funded. I don't know. Was it the merits of the play? Was it the other? I don't know, but yeah, it just seems an odd one to me. And I'm just
Yeah.
wondering over the
I,
last decade, if say for example a group like LGB Alliance, because to me with discrimination, it seems as though there seems to be like a very thin line when it comes to discrimination. Like you could say something or do something and it's always classed as racist, whereas I think life sometimes it could be, but sometimes I think life is a bit more complicated than that. I'm
mm,
just wondering with not just racism but sexism or if you want about transphobia, if say LGBT Alliance was on that list,
mm,
there's an argument to say that they'd be classed, oh, the government could put them on a list, oh, because we think they're transphobic. I'm not saying they are, I'm just using it as
mm.
an example. I just wonder in the current climate we're in, how far would that list go? Because I understand it, but I'm just wondering with the way the government is now, and even like if say a new government gets elected in come the elections this year, whether that list will actually be extended, and would that contribute to actually a downfall in art in this country?
Well, I mean, it's called it's terrorism basically on the list. The
Yeah.
prescribed organisations have a history of violence or inciting violence. Um, so mostly they're not applying for arts grants. So
Yeah.
I don't think that in itself, the prescribed terrorist list would see much would see any less applicants in the arts. But I think you could say the more that you politicize the arts, the greater the risk of narrowing the content. Um, so if you only so I mean the example is you know, how many plays are there that are pro-Brexit that have been made? I mean, it's a crass example, really, but you know, so there is a sort of politicisation of the arts, of arts funding, anyway. So how that's come about is really a big subject of research that I'd like to think about. But how much influence government has on arts funding, again, that's just forever a tenuous relationship. It's because there's a principle of all of these bodies being arm's length bodies and not directed by government. But inevitably, there is some connection with government because it's government funds, it's taxpayers' funding. So
Yeah, like I said, we live in interesting times, to say the truth. I just think, especially with the arts, I think, because like I said, when I spoke to Rosie, she talked about from an artistic point of view, which is I completely understand, because I do writing myself and I've written scripts just for pleasure myself. And I just wonder, in terms of the administration side, obviously you talked about your story and the rewarding of grants, but in terms of the administration side, how has it changed as well in other ways in the year in the times you've been there?
well, I mean, the arts has changed absolutely massively. Well, certainly in terms of administration, because if you think back to the 90s, we didn't have the National Lottery. So when the National Lottery came into arts funding, there was a huge boom in available resources that mainly came through under New Labour in the 1997 and onwards.
Yeah.
And that led to lots of new buildings, you know, like Walsall Art Gallery and the Lowry in Manchester, and you know, so all of these new buildings basically came through an injection of lottery funding that the arts had never had before, and that made a whole new infrastructure across the whole country. But along with that, also came under the Blair administration the Freedom of Information Act, and combining the Freedom of Information Act with National Lottery support, which remember isn't taxpayers funding resources, it's lottery players' resources. It's not even coming out of tax. That gave arts administrators a much stronger rationale to be a lot more open about where arts funding was going. You know, and so first of all, people were putting freedom of information requests in, as they still do, and as they're perfectly entitled to do, to find out how funding was made. So the first thing that happened was that funding decisions became much more transparent. So what were decisions that were essentially a conversation when I started turned into, well, certainly by the time I'd started, had turned into an application process. And then the application process had to be transparent. And then the thinking around, well, hang on, it's lottery players that are paying for all of this. They need to get a cut of the action, you know, they need to benefit from it. So then the funding turned into, well, who are the beneficiaries? Who's getting this? You know, it's not fair if they're paying for it, but they don't get any of the benefits of it. So that started to change arts funding into much more kind of, well, what's the impact for the public? So those two things together, freedom of information and the National Lottery, hugely changed arts funding now. So what you see now is a much more transparent process, much more focused on reaching a wider audience. But does it? And does that lead you into a kind of area of identity as opposed to benefit? Does that make sense? If you start to try and work out, you come from the best intentions, which was, you know, the most money should go to the most people, or the, you know, that kind of Bentium benefits utilitarianism, that funding goes to the people that are actually paying for it. But in order to make sure that that happens, you start to be quite instrumental. So you start thinking more about who this is going to and what it's about as content, and less about art. Is it good? You know, is it fun? You know,
Yeah,
and so it starts from the best of intentions, it can end up quite identity driven. And
yeah, yeah. It's weird. I was just wondering, actually, is it so? Would you so just to sum up, would you say it's more being more of a tick box as opposed to art for the sake of art's sake and just being good for the whole society? Has it become more and more rigid and more of a tick box, or is that not the case?
well, there's certainly a lot of tick boxes. I
Yeah,
can kind of understand that as well from exactly what I was saying before. You want it to have the most impact, so you've got to find out if it is having the most impact. So you need boxes in order to find that out. But when you've got limited resources, you could actually just sort of fund through tick boxes, really, you know, because you don't have enough money to fund everything anyway. So it is it's a difficult thing to balance, really. But unfortunately, a side product of that kind of culture, I think, is that you can end up with people obsessing more about identity than about the quality of the work. And you end up in identity arguments, you know,
yeah,
and you end up in these kind of hierarchies of and then you start to interrogate people's beliefs. And that's happened in the arts where people there's a sort of kind of groupthink of belief systems that people buy into as a way of um as a kind of a way of playing that identity hierarchy.
yeah, yeah. It's I see it sometimes in the theatre because theatres, well, I want to go for theatre for a long time, but yeah, I read some of the look at some of the plays and then look at some of the synopsis of some of the plays, and I think you can tell this is being funded like almost like because you look read a synopsis and you think, well, okay, we'll put this female character there, we'll put this black character there, and it's not like the character. It's just the I can't describe what the word is, but basically, they're just the main characteristics, the facial
Yeah.
characteristics. Um,
I
except
thought that
for like
about
the
the
whole world-roundedness of the character sometimes when I
yeah,
sometimes read these like play and you see that on T I know it's not like funded but see that on the TV sometimes as well. Would that be a fair point that it seems a lot of say plays and other like I say it's more identity driven and almost oh well if this type of person's doing it then that's great as opposed to the actual content of the art itself.
yeah. I sort of thought that about I watched Passenger the other day. Have you seen that?
No, I've not seen Passenger.
It's on ITV, and I thought, yeah, I sort of thought that this has got all of the elements that make it interesting, but actually the writing isn't very good. You know,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
doesn't kind of hang together because it's got all of these jostling, it's northern, it's this, you know, but the actual heart of it, the writing is pretty weak. Uh,
Mm,
anyway, so yeah, anyway, that's a that's not so there's loads of really good stuff as well. So we mustn't be like really negative or critical, but that I just think I just really find the identity stuff just getting really oppressive.
yeah. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think patronizing as well. As
Mm.
okay, you're going to stick this particular character from that's the immutable characteristic. That's what I was trying to find. You're going to stick a character that has this particular immutable characteristic, and then everyone else from that characteristic has that characteristic is going to flood into that. And I think, well, it's not. That's not how life works. Like we all have different. There's things that all of us are affected by. It's more, like you say, it's more about the writing as opposed to which identity is in what, and I just find it very patronizing. Shakespeare is a great example. I've seen four Shakespeare plays, and I think with those, it's like I didn't care who was in a cast. It was like they were just well acted, and the stories are very good.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
just going back to funding, before the lottery came into play, I know you've described a little bit. What was funding like for theatres before that? How difficult or how easy was it?
Well, it's a little bit before my time, to be honest. Um, but there was I mean, the thing about the lottery is it has allowed quite kind of a lot of risk taking. So when you're talking about like looking at a you know a theatre program, there'll be works in the programme that are blockbusters and that can pay for themselves. And there'll be works in the programme that are only going to have a really small audience. But they're still good and they still need to be made, but they are going to need public funding to kind of keep going. And those places, those shows which might have quite small audiences are also a bit of a training ground for emerging practitioners, directors, and theatre makers. So what the funding will have looked like, I'm assuming, without, I must admit, I haven't got a great deal of knowledge pre-lottery, is there would have been a lot less venues and a lot more blockbusters and a lot less risk-taking works, works that just couldn't have survived on a commercial basis. So I think that's why you're saying, like, the art world there's a lot more work that doesn't necessarily have a huge audience, but it is still of benefit because, first of all, there are niche audiences, but it also is kind of the training ground for new performance, and it's the thinking ground. But then sometimes it just runs away with itself, so you get really mad show that you think, why is that being funded by the public purse? There was a show at Battersea Arts Centre in which a couple, two trans men, in other words, two women, interviewed members of the audience to be potential sperm donors for a baby. And that was funded at nearly £70,000 from the National Lottery. Now, you've got to think to yourself, if you ask lottery players, do they want to fund the production of children in that way through a kind of trivial performance on stage? I mean, I found that really shocking. So now that is exactly the kind of show that could not have survived a commercial audience. It's not got a commercial audience. So who funds it? Lottery players. Is that what we want to fund? Yeah.
I said to you before, I'm really surprised now, but that's just so. I'm gonna be so.
It's called First Trimester, the show.
Yeah.
It
Ethically, how would you
really
fund that show?
questions morality, doesn't it?
Yeah, I just.
What if a child is conceived at Battersea Art Centre, or is?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know.
I was going to say, ethic. You talk about criteria when you're running out grants. Wouldn't ethics be one of those? And surely wouldn't that fall under ethics as well? I mean, that just seems bizarre.
No, ethics isn't a criteria.
Oh, okay. So, gosh, yeah, that's that's
I
blown me
mean,
away.
the arts has always come up against kind of discussions about ethics. So, but no, it's. But I think that's very unethical. And the other way of looking at it as well is National Lottery is actually gambling. It's gambling
Yeah, yeah.
resources. So gambling is paying for this.
Oh my.
When you look at it like that, it makes your head go a bit.
That's crazy. How long ago was that? Did that happen?
It's about 6 months ago.
Gosh, okay.
Yeah, I'm sure there's
Oh,
loads more like that, really crazy shows. But
oh,
that one, I just found particularly awful because it was about a child. It
yeah,
wasn't about a willing participants in a way. Um,
yeah.
yeah.
Oh, that's mad.
So yeah. So you asked me about criteria. So yeah. So criteria is a bit thin on the ground. So areas that are missing, yes, ethics, but then ethics is a moving feast, and as is open to political sensitivity, depending on people's politics or beliefs or religions. So it's a big area. Safeguarding, there's no consideration of safeguarding in arts funding that I'm aware of. Really, it's very thin. And then freedom of speech is, so if or freedom of artistic expression, again, that's very weak in arts funding. There's nothing really that protects it in Arts Council policies that I'm aware of. Now, I might have got that wrong, but I don't think it's there. And I've very rarely seen it in arts organisations as well. So some of those kind of what you might call like social consensus criteria, like as a country, there's a strong support for free speech. People see that as an important part of democracy. There's a strong commitment to make sure that vulnerable people and children aren't at risk. There's an idea that we kind of do the right thing. Those three areas, they're not embedded in public funding, I don't think. Certainly not in the arts. And that's where we wanted to focus on, particularly around the artistic freedom, in fact, solely in that area, to see if we can help to embed that within stakeholders and funding systems, but also within the arts, that they've got a responsibility to protect artistic freedom. And that means they've got to be impartial. So it means that things that politically are not, don't rock your boat, you can still go and see it. Now that doesn't mean it's racist, it doesn't mean it's inciting violence. It might well mean it's trans men doing a show, that's fine. It's but none of that is embedded. So what we think is that there's in freedom in the arts is that there's a lot of risks there if we don't strengthen artistic freedom. In fact, it's quite interesting. We've been looking at a report that was written in 2013 by an organisation called Index on Censorship, and in 2013 it was a I can't remember where, I think it might have been at South Bank Centre. It was a conference for the arts, and the big concern then was more around religious attacks, religious fundamentalism closing down shows. So Charlie Hebdo had just happened. There was threats to artists that were making work that was perceived as irreligious, or so there was a threat there around what was perceived to be kind of a right wing was the threat, and the left were worried about the arts being closed down. And partly as a result of that, people were self-censoring, Now, we've seen it now the other way. It's now perceived as freedom of expression is now seen as a right-wing thing. And the left, I think the left are closing it down, but we've still got this problem of self-censorship where people are frightened to speak or to say what they think. I mean, obviously I don't support anybody harassing anybody or discriminating against anybody. So when I say people are free to speak, it's not that I think people should be able to be offensive to individuals for the sake of it, or but we have to be free to disagree, and that has to be there in the arts because that's our thinking space.
This I was going to ask you as well. You talk about self-censorship. Why are artists self-censoring? Because especially in this day and age, I've always felt, well, first of all, with artists, the actual fact that you've got the freedom to express yourself, the freedom to say what you want as part of your art, I think that's part of being an artist. But second of all, and this is an advantage I think people have now that they wouldn't have decades before, you have different platforms whereby you can raise money for art, like crowdfunding, and also put your art on like YouTube and do your own website, but yet you still have this artist self-censoring. I just wanted your thoughts into why you think more artists seem to be more self-censoring than they have done for a long time.
Well, in my case, I said what I thought and I lost my job. So, and that happens to, and I was in a very privileged position. I've been in a job for 15 years and so I was much more privileged than many people are. And working in the arts, people's incomes are much more fragile. People are just making work as they go along. So you get a commission if you get on well with people and your work fits in. Now, if you start not fitting in because of your views, then you won't be able to continue making work. So people are much more vulnerable to attacks on their reputation than you are if you're in a permanent contract because you're freelance. So because of that, people self-censor, and some artists actually are tending to work more abroad now and in other European countries than in the UK, because they're finding they just can't get the contracts with or the commissions in the UK, because there's such a kind of the argument around trans rights and gender critical women has become so incendiary. It's just really difficult for people to say what they think working in the arts. Their careers are just much more volatile.
Yeah, it's a shame. And you alluded to something I was going to ask as well. It seems to me that in like mainland Europe, especially art-wise, maybe you know better than me, I imagine you do, but there seems to be a little bit more freedom in regards to what you can say and what you can do. I know you had the Charlie Hebdo in France, but that aside, just in mainland Europe, there seems to be a little bit more freedom in regards to what you can say and what you can do. Is that the case, or is this what's happening in the UK happening in mainland
I
Europe?
think there's struggles all over Europe actually in this area, and the war at the moment in the Middle East, has really has brought that to light. And we've seen that in Germany. It's there's much more battles going on around that issue, around the war between Palestine and Israel, because Germany has a law against anti-Semitism, very clear law against anti-Semitism. So that's seen a lot of artists who are supportive of the Palestinian side pulling out or having their work removed. So it's really it's not great. And in a lot of countries, it's really, really difficult issues, and there are difficult issues at the heart of it. There's dispute, between us and between points of view that are perhaps not reconcilable. So that's what we want to look at, you see, in Freedom in the Arts. How do we make sure in this country we have as wide a space as we can, given that there's always going to be constraints and there's always going to be friction, and there's always going to be disagreement. Now we need to make sure, even within that, that we're not so fearful that we close down that space, but even within those constraints, we make sure that our public and private sector are still open to ideas, and to avoiding the groupthink of employees or staff groups, or so that people can continue to make freely. And in fact, one of the things that we are looking at doing is researching the work that hasn't been made or hasn't been collected because somebody's been labelled as transphobic or something like that. We're sort of thinking about how we'll find those individuals that have got that work that they can't make as a result of just a perception of who they are. So that'd be quite interesting, because that's a kind of way of replenishing the arts canon, so that it because otherwise we will end up in 30 years, we'll go, oh, all the work was about one subject. Where was all the other stuff?
Yeah. So tell me more about Freedom in the Arts, how it was founded, what your mission statement, what plans have you got for that organisation going into the future?
Yeah, well, we've just got going. We got going in October. We launched a Battle of Ideas. We've got an advisory group who are kind of giving us ideas and think, because you can want to do absolutely everything. We are going to do absolutely everything. So we've come up with a program that's a mixture of debate and research. And we're also looking into how we can also advise, because we get a lot of artists getting in touch with us that are absolutely petrified of losing their careers, or already being hounded out of their careers. And they have a lot of needs. They have legal needs, they have comms and PR needs, and they actually have mental health needs as well, because it's a bit of a life crisis when that happens to you. Because there's a distinction in the arts between other professions, because artists are it's a public profession. You know, you have to practice in the public realm. People have to see you. You can't step back into the cupboard, you know, you've got to keep out there. So yeah, so that advised strand, we're looking at how to develop that properly. The research strand is a series of events, a symposium, roundtables, and hopefully a podcast, which we want to be able to launch. We've got that public programme, and then alongside that, we've got a research programme, which provides case studies, data on censorship in this country, and then looks at developing a mechanism that we can support organisations to embed artistic freedom and influence policymakers. And then the final bit of that, as I mentioned before, was kind of researching the unmade work or the unseen work and seeing if we can gradually build up those partnerships to realise some of those pieces of work. So that's the plan.
Yeah.
But yeah, we are excited about it, and we're speaking to lots of people that are interested in contributing, and hopefully we'll be able to launch that programme so we've got a full public programme that people can get involved with.
Just end on a positive. In the next 5 years, both from an administration side and just in terms of art in general, where would you like to see both of those develop in the future? So what would be your hopes in terms of how it develops?
Yeah, well, our aim is sort of quite simple, really, and it's just to provide the sector with the confidence and the mechanisms to embed artistic freedom. So we don't see people getting cancelled for their views, or shows being closed down because somebody doesn't like it in the staff group. We don't see fearful leaders of organisations just, you know, leaving artistic policy to a couple of staff members. We see a much more confident and diverse sector, in which it's diversity of belief as well. So perhaps we just see a lot of different shows, you know, as well as the stuff we've got now, but I'm sure there's people that are just not getting their work seen. Yeah.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. It's been an eye-opener. There's a lot of things I didn't realise. What I will do in the description of the video on YouTube, because we're on YouTube and Spotify as well, is I'll leave a link to the Freedom in the Arts website page so people can click onto that as well. All right. Denise Fahmy, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chris. See you again. Bye-bye.